Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Dr. Mike Brazier.
We are rejoined today to continue our discussion about the harvest management of white-cheeked geese in the Pacific Northwest. We are grateful to be rejoined by our two guests here, Kyle Spriggans, Waterfowl Section Manager with Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, and Brandon Reiches, Migratory Game Bird Coordinator for Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. Brandon and Kyle, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
So on the last episode, we concluded, we wrapped up basically on our last episode, a broad discussion about the taxonomic issues of the white-cheeked geese that inhabit and are found in the Pacific Northwest. And we began to introduce some of the harvest management considerations around this group of birds. And that's where we're going to go in some detail on this particular episode. So Brandon, my first question I will throw to you. And I'm going to ask you just to sort of frame up for our listeners, maybe those that aren't very familiar with goose management, goose harvest management procedures. Give us the basics on how harvest management for, let's stick with white-cheeked geese, but how white-cheeked geese occurs.
Kind of as I talked about earlier, with these various populations of white-cheeked geese that are coming from different areas, as well as how they've evolved, that they have become different and identifiable. That has just led to different management goals for all the various populations. And so the flyways, each of the four flyways has generally developed population management plans for these various populations of white-cheeked geese and other types of geese as well. And that's because those populations generally nest in a localized area, migrate through a specific area, and then typically winter in a specific area. In a lot of cases, the wintering grounds may overlap, but generally the breeding grounds don't. And so it's when the wintering grounds overlap that you end up having the complexity, because you have competing objectives and goals. That's kind of been the way it's gone for all of the flyways. However, it's just exceedingly complex out here because of the number of different populations that we're dealing with. I grew up in southwestern Minnesota. Like I said, I grew up goose hunting at Lac qui Parle, when that Lac qui Parle area may be familiar to a lot of those folks in Minnesota. After I was working for Oregon, I went back and hunted one day with my dad, and the check station had a little display that talked about the complexities of Canada goose management, and they had the three kinds of geese that are basically present in the Mississippi flyway. And I just laughed, it's just like, well, we got 7. We see your 3 and raise you 7. So this isn't a problem that just is germane to this flyway, but because of the number of subspecies that we're dealing with, that's why it's become really complex. But on the other hand, we are lucky that a couple of our main drivers, the Duskys, because of their very restricted population size and some of the issues that they deal with as far as reproduction and recruitment into the breeding population, you can tell them apart for the most part. They're big and they're dark. And then we've got our small cacklers, which, yes, they're abundant, but they've gone through some issues in the past, and you can generally tell them apart. They're very small and dark as well. So we are lucky on that front. There was a time when this was all a lot simpler for certain. Dusky Canada geese have been a recognized subspecies for a long time, decades and decades. Our evolution of waterfowl management in the continent, really started in the late 40s into the 50s. That's when the flyway systems got going. Dusky Canada geese were recognized at that time. And in fact, our harvest regulations for geese in this area of Oregon were directed at Dusky Canada geese. And we even had separate reduced bag limits and shorter seasons in the heavily used Dusky areas in the 1950s and 1960s. And that was, again, because of the concern over population status, even at that time. But back then, this was really the only geese. You had Duskys in Western Oregon, occasionally a lesser or occasionally a tavener. Like I mentioned, those taverners started coming on in the 60s and 70s. And then things really got crazy in the 80s when you added in all of the cacklers, a declining population at that time. And Duskys really started to struggle due to the, Kelly may have touched on it, but, why we're concerned about Duskys is, yes, they're a restricted population, but they also have had a very difficult time over the last 35 years of producing enough young to keep their population going at a strong rate. And that is actually all due to an earthquake that occurred in 1964. It physically raised the Copper River Delta by several meters, which allowed a whole kind of trophic change. The habitat changed from salt marsh to more of an upland drier marsh. Trees and shrub vegetation started encroaching areas that typically it would have been flooded out by high tides. That changed the predator community up there. You started having, predation by bears, coyotes, even wolves. The most significant predator of these geese is actually turned out to be bald eagles. They have probably expanded their range on the Delta because of the trees that have grown up over the last 55, 60 years since that earthquake occurred, giving eagles perch sites. As soon as the eagles have perch sites, they can sit and watch. They can find Duskys. They can find Dusky nests. And so we've, gone through this decline in Dusky populations. We've had this increase in other types of wintering geese. And it has really led to a management conundrum where you have competing objectives. And our big competing objectives are the population status of Duskys, which, our decision is right now that, with everything else that's going on, they essentially cannot support a sport harvest because everything that else is going on is the agricultural damage issue that we face down here. So as we mentioned in previous episode, potentially upwards of 300,000 geese in a good year wintering here. 15,000 of those are Duskys, so not a high number. But those multitudes of other geese are causing some significant agricultural damage issues for our farmers. And so if it was simply the easiest thing would just be to say, we feel that the Duskys cannot support any harvest, and therefore we need to make sure Duskys aren't harvested. The goose season's closed, period. Right? Well, we can't go there because if we close the goose season on Duskys, it closes, on all geese. We end up in this situation where the farmers are just getting hammered day in and day out. And sport hunting certainly can help those agricultural producers alleviate some of the damage that's occurring, right? You put a group of hunters out in their field for the day, they're not going to have any damage that day. And then they're probably not going to have any damage, in a couple subsequent days, just because, the geese got hazed out of there. You get a little bit of population reduction from hunting, right? But that's not what we're going at when we're talking about helping the farmers. It's not we're trying to reduce the population to help them. It's that we're trying to use the hunting seasons as a tool to help reduce the incidences of damage that are going on. And so that really becomes the balancing act. And certainly the third part of it is that, we want to provide some sport harvest opportunity to our hunters out there. And so we have these three kind of competing things going on. You got the population status of Duskys, our desire to provide sport hunting, our desire to help out the hunters, as well as, kind of then the status and the considerations for these other populations. And that's specifically the cacklers. We've got a management plan, just like we do for Duskys, for the cacklers, that says we want to maintain that population at about, for the flyway, not just Oregon, at about 250,000. And, we're actually slightly below that right now, just a little bit. And so that, even becomes, a third consideration that we've got to take into account. It's all a big stew and we've all got to take a bite, I guess, is maybe the best way to put it. But it really is a complex situation, and there's not a lot of easy answers.
Throughout any of these episodes that are on this podcast, and really any of our communications about waterfowl management in North America, we speak repeatedly about our use of science to inform our decision, inform our understanding of how waterfowl populations work, how they respond to habitat variation, how they respond to the effects of harvest. We base as many of our decisions as possible on a high level of science. And for those issues where we don't have full understanding, we base it on what information we have is the best available information. So science is a persistent, reliable scientific information is a persistent theme in waterfowl management in North America. And it becomes really important, and my read of things here, it becomes really important in these types of issues where we have different subspecies of geese, as we've talked about here, that breed in different areas and that may combine on the wintering grounds, as well as individual breeding populations of the same species, as may be the case for some species. So from the perspective, Kyle, I'll direct this to you, from the perspective of white-cheeked geese, their harvest management in the Pacific Northwest. As we look back through the years, what have been some of the most important tools that we've used to understand the existence of different goose populations, where they migrate through, and how we would go about trying to construct some harvest regulations that accommodate the needs of those populations while providing that recreational sport harvest. And I'm thinking about things such as neck collars. When we think about geese, that's one of the neck collars in geese are about as popular and frequently discussed as are leg bands in ducks, based on my read of things. But in addition to neck collars and bands, I'm also thinking about any type of telemetry. What goes into understanding these populations, where they exist, where they go, and how we need to work around those things relative to those specific populations?
That's a very good question. And certainly this complex of geese, this white-cheeked goose complex, is a really good test of you need to use everything because it depends on sort of the circumstances around how readily can you get some of that information. Brandon made mention of sort of those three considerations. We're trying to conserve the population itself. We're trying to provide opportunity. And then of course we're trying to opportunity to harvest. And then we're trying to, balance that with some of the social economic considerations in different areas. And that's certainly where that flyway co-management model kicks in, right? My considerations in Washington are not necessarily the same in Oregon, certainly aren't the same in California. And of course, all of this, we're talking about Alaska. So our equivalent up in Alaska is thinking about all of these populations in a completely different way and sort of trying to sit down together, lay out this information that we have available to us. The best information that we have available to us is critical to that. So how do we get that information? Brandon also mentioned that some of these populations, in terms of where they're breeding, for example, the Aleutian geese, they're 3,000 miles off of the mainland of Alaska out on the Aleutian chain. There is no way that we will ever be able to monitor the breeding population in terms of sort of nests on the ground side of things. And so because of that, each one of these has required some level of monitoring that might differ depending on which population we're focused on. So you mentioned neck collars, certainly banding and just the federal metal bands and neck collars have been a big piece of that, particularly for the cacklers, the Duskys, and the Aleutian geese. In all three of those cases, we're using neck collars to either establish some sort of relationship between when we count so many here, how many does that actually translate to in terms of a population estimate? Or in the case of Duskys, we're using the neck collars to actually track annual survival rates. We have a massive resighting effort on the wintering grounds between Washington and Oregon where we have biologists and technicians running around out there to try and recite as many of these collars as we can, because that is what feeds into our ability to derive, well, is survival steady? Is it declining? Is something wrong? In other cases, we do have an ability to actually monitor the population from a breeding index. The cacklers that are out on the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta, that coastal Western Alaska region, there are aerial surveys that are complemented by ground nest surveys that allow us to get some inference about how is that population doing, how widespread is it. In 2011, they used net collars up there on the refuge. They deployed them. Technicians and biologists recite them on the wintering grounds. And that allowed this sort of correction, this sort of when they count so many on the ground from the plane, we see this many down in the wintering areas. And so that allows us to actually get a better number that we believe is closer to a population estimate. Part of the flyway process is basically working collaboratively together to understand what monitoring is possible, what monitoring actually gives us the information to consider those decisions, weigh what is the status? What is the trend? Are we talking about an increasing population, a stable population, or a declining population? And then where it really comes together is each one of the states has to figure out, okay, like I have this multiple layers of consideration. I obviously, Western Canada geese, the ones that breed here in our states, are a major contributor to the overall harvest. So that's where a lot of that, interest in harvest opportunity lies. But then you have to ask, okay, do we have Duskys on top of that? Okay, that's going to require some restrictive considerations. Do we have other geese that we have less certainty around their status that might concern us about how many of the days can we really take advantage of? And the other tool that we have at our disposal in terms of a harvest strategy side is that, similar to the ducks, there's the ability to create goose zones, specific areas or regions of the state where you're trying to cater some level of management decision. Maybe that's bag limits. Maybe that's when the days of the season are allowed. You're trying to cater that to the actual goose opportunities that exist. And so certainly the shared Southwest Washington, Northwest zone of Oregon, where we have these 7 subspecies of white-cheeked geese, all of that comes together in sort of that decision matrix, and us trying to balance sort of how do we accommodate all 3 of those objectives and goals that Brandon was talking about.
One of the, I'm going to guess, most well-known examples of how harvest managers create special zones or special seasons to enable and to allow harvest on one particular group of birds without exposing other more sensitive birds to that type of harvest would be the early resident Canada goose seasons that we see at least in the eastern U.S. We see a lot of that. Those seasons, my understanding is correct. Again, I have to caveat all of these types of things by saying I don't have a seat at the harvest table. I've never been an active participant in much of the harvest management processes, but my understanding is that those early seasons are designed to enable harvest of those problematic resident Canada goose populations at a time when there's little risk of any other subspecies or populations of Canada geese being in those regions. In that vein, do y'all have those early season resident Canada goose? I guess they would probably be the Western Canada goose based on Brandon's previous description. Do y'all have those early season opportunities in Washington and Oregon?
That's correct. Yeah, most of the Pacific Flyway states take advantage of some version of that, and it depends on how many zones you have in your state. Washington, we have 5 zones, and so the dates might change a little bit depending on which one of those zones. But the intent is exactly what you're getting at, is that we have Western Canada geese as our only nesting goose in the state, and to try and separate out the overlap of, okay, these ones that nest here versus these ones that are coming down from Alaska. Typically in Washington, those dates are set very early in September. extraordinarily early in September in some years, just to try and avoid that overlap of crossing into the sort of migrant presence on the landscape.
As I'm listening to, kind of going back through my head about what I said, it occurs to me that I probably have to apologize to the harvest managers out there. A lot of them are probably wishing that I would have not used the term resident Canada geese. I think I've heard strong preference for the use of term temperate nesting geese, at least here in among my Mississippi Flyway counterparts. Do you get that issue out west, Kyle and Brandon? Do you prefer temperate nesting geese as opposed to resident?
I don't think that's as big of an issue out here. I think for the most part, we just still call them resident Canada geese. I know there's been some terminology, changes in the especially the mid-continent area and some other things. But yeah, if you say resident goose, we know what you're talking about.
Okay, all right.
It is a good point. I mean, resident Canada goose, a lot of times, the inference is just that they nest in the lower 48, right? And it's an interesting one because on the east side of Washington, we do have consistent and repeated harvest records from geese getting harvested up in Alberta, because actually there is this sort of molt migration phenomenon that goes on. And so it can't, people think of it more in that sort of urban problematic standpoint when someone says the term resident Canada goose. But yeah, Brandon's right. For us, it usually just means the one that nests in our state and not necessarily the problematic aspect of it.
Let's transition to a discussion of some of the harvest regulations around Dusky Canada geese. And you guys can filter into this particular conversation other aspects of white-cheeked goose harvest management as you want to. But obviously, Duskies are a big part of the conversation out there. A lot of the regulations in place are geared around that subspecies. So, Brandon, just walk us through or highlight some of the measures that have been taken through the years to enable that harvest or to enable harvest of other Canada geese without while trying to minimize the exposure and hunting mortality to Dusky Canada geese. I know there have been several different approaches taken. So just give us an idea on the history of those tools and techniques used.
So, as I previously mentioned, it was in the early 1980s that Duskies really started to crash. Essentially that lack of poor production, after what happened with the earthquake, kind of caught up to them. Recruitment and production of young, and then recruitment into the adult population, was dismal for a number of years. And anytime you have that happening, you're going to get a population decline. And so at that time, that was occurring. They were just a goose, right? So they had, there was a goose season in Western Oregon and Western Washington. It was X number of days long. It was shorter than it is now, but it was just a goose season. And so in 1984, due to the population status of Dusky Canada geese, essentially the flyways at Kyle and I's level, along with the Fish and Wildlife Service, kind of said, we're recommending a closed goose season. No harvest opportunity. Well, that's really unpopular with folks. And so once it got to the council level, this idea of, hey, these Duskies are different enough that we think hunters can avoid them and still harvest other types of geese. And so therein was born the permit zone check station quota system. And it grew over time. At first, it was just a very small area of Oregon and Washington, much smaller than we're talking about, just basically the Sauvie Island area and adjacent Ridgefield Refuge area in Washington. And it grew over time. And the deal is that there was a quota on Dusky Canada geese. All geese that were harvested by hunters had to be brought into a check station daily, so that managers could classify them to the various subspecies. If you shot a Dusky Canada goose, your permit to hunt that season was invalidated. So you were done hunting any geese for the season. And to even be able to hunt, you had to pass an identification course. At first, it was just you had to take a course. It wasn't necessarily a test, but you just had to show up somewhere, have somebody tell you about these various types of geese, so on and so forth, and then you were able to go. Several years later, it actually became an exam that you had to pass, an identification exam, And that's actually continued to this day. So if you took a Dusky, permit became invalid for the season. Obviously, the overall quota went up by 1. Hopefully you didn't take more than 1. You were legally allowed to take 1. It was not a violation to take a Dusky. You got 1 for the year. That was your permit. But then, of course, if you took your 1, especially on purpose, you're being a little selfish, because now the quota got triggered by, and at some point the entire season closes for everybody if too many get taken. So a lot of hunters actually viewed it as a closed season because they didn't want to take 1 and end their hunting, and they didn't want to risk ending everybody's hunting. So that was the permit zone check station, and that basically went on in some form or another from 84 until 2015. The number of Duskies in the overall quota might have varied depending on their population status, not generally from year to year, but there was a time when the quota went up because the Duskies went over 15,000 or 12,500 or something, and then it went down because the Duskies dropped below a certain level. But generally, things went along as smooth as they could. The biggest hang up, though, was that every goose you shot, even if it was just one little cackler, that, and let's say you shot it on you lived on a farm and you shot it on your farm, the nearest check station was 25 miles away, and you just shot one cackler, you had to bring it to the check station. And the rules that were implemented to do that is every day that you hunted, you had a blank harvest card. And immediately after taking a goose, you've got to write ink on that harvest card. I just shot a goose. And once you write on it for a day, it's only good for that day. The only way to get a new one for a subsequent day is to go to the check station. It was a system where it worked from a harvest management standpoint. We kept Dusky harvest low, but it was a heavy, heavy burden on the sport hunting public, and likely burdensome enough that it was discouraging hunters from even participating. And it was probably encouraging some of the hunters to just say, I'm just shooting geese and I ain't going to the check station, and I'll take my chances of getting caught. And so it's always been unpopular with the hunters. It eventually did encompass the entire region. We basically had no more closed areas except a very, very tiny portion of Tillamook County that still exists. The refuge, some of the national wildlife refuges are closed as some of our state lands, but from just private lands of the state saying you can't hunt geese out on these farm fields, we really don't have that anymore.
Brandon, was that check station approach in place for both Oregon and Washington? And was it implemented similarly?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we've through the federal process for what we call our Northwest permit zone here in Oregon, and Washington's Southwest permit zone on their side of the Columbia. It's been the same federal regulations. So we've implemented essentially near identical programs over time. However, so we did that for a long time, and that all included this time frame when cackling geese, our little cacklers, became much more abundant, and they began driving the system from a harvest standpoint. That's what most people were shooting. And they also began driving the system from an agricultural damage standpoint. Duskies had been doing okay. They're always going to be a small population, and it's debatable in the current landscape of our wintering goose flocks if we could ever have a general sports season on Duskies, simply because we've got enough of these other geese that we can have long liberal seasons, but we don't have enough Duskies to have a long liberal season, even if they were probably producing enough young. Back in the 50s and 60s, when they didn't have a recruitment problem, our seasons were not nearly as long as they are now, and we did not have the high bag limits that we do now. So that's debatable if we ever got to that place where Duskies were doing good enough. But we felt that Duskies were doing well enough, that their population was stable enough that we could get rid of the check station system. Again, that was the burden on hunters, was having to go to a check station every day. Sometimes it literally was a 50-mile round trip for some hunters. Some hunters, it was easy. You might drive by it on the way home. What's the big deal? And of course, it was burdensome from the from an agency standpoint, in Oregon, we were hiring 9 seasonal employees a year to run these check stations. That's all they did is sit in the check station, look at geese during the hunting season. So when we revised the Dusky management plan, starting in about 2012, I think is when the discussions really got going. Oregon and Washington, we made a push to change the way that we did business when it came to Dusky harvest management, and really harvest management in these permit zones, which is related to Duskies. And so at that time, we actually closed the season completely for Duskies. We proved through time that you can identify these things. The hunters can generally avoid them. We know mistakes are going to happen. We know that same thing happens with, low pintail bag limits, or even, 15 years ago when it was, pintails were closed for portions of the season. So we know mistakes happen, but generally people can avoid harvesting Duskies, especially when all these other subspecies are so abundant, especially the cacklers. So we close the season for Duskies. And as soon as the season's closed, there's no need for a quota. And if there's no need for a quota, there's no need for check stations. And so it became a much simpler season to administer. We no longer had to require hunters to go to check stations. We still require the ID test. And so, like we mentioned earlier, Kelly's helped us out with some of our ID materials. We have those online. We even had a very old video that's still out there that Kyle and I's predecessors put together in the 1990s, talking about the issues, talking about how to identify these birds. So we've got materials out there for folks to hopefully at least realize that, give them some information on how to identify them. Hopefully they're also hunting with, they're not just entirely new to the game, right? Somebody takes you out that knows the ropes. But even if they are new to the game, putting the emphasis on there that, if it's a relatively large Canada goose, especially if it's dark and it honks, like a deep honking Canada goose, just don't shoot it. Focus on those small geese, focus on the cacklers. And so far it seems to, have been successful. Yes, we've had some incidences where, law enforcement has uncovered people, trying to sneak a Dusky out of the field. But that happened in the check station days too. And so, basically what we hoped we were doing was trading the potentially lawful harvest of Duskies, but then the unlawful not going to check stations. Hopefully, probably just trading a very small amount that was going on and just saying, now it's just closed, period. And if you want to take your chances sneaking them out, law enforcement, has got a good chance of getting you. But we don't think that we've increased Dusky harvest by doing what we did to any, large degree that's having a detriment to the population.
So if a hunter harvests a Dusky Canada goose and they are checked by a conservation officer, they are given a citation. Do they lose their permit for the remainder of that year? What all goes along with the violation in harvesting a Dusky nowadays?
So at least in Oregon, if the law enforcement officer, we're kind of strange out here, right? We don't really have conservation officer in Oregon. We're one of the only states where our Oregon State Police actually have a law enforcement, wildlife law enforcement, fish and wildlife law enforcement branch. So out here we call them troopers. But so if a trooper finds you with a Dusky, or if a Fish and Wildlife Service law enforcement out there, you're certainly subject to citation. And again, that's up to them, right? You can get a warning for speeding. You can get a warning for unlawful harvest too. So you're subject to citation. And then, we do hope that information is passed on to us, because if you have taken a Dusky, you've shown that, you potentially do need to take that test again. And so we have the ability to revoke those people if the law enforcement officer, wants them. And that becomes the crux of the issue, is that, there's no requirement for them to come talk to us and say this person took a Dusky. But if they do notify us, they are invalidated in the system as part of one of our rules, and they would have to retake the test in a subsequent year.
Kyle, I have a couple of questions here for you. And I guess this will start with that same question as it relates to what happens if a hunter harvests a dusky Canada goose in the state of Washington and they are and they're caught. What's the process? I mean, are they subject to the same citation and then loss of the permit as Brandon described?
Correct. Yeah, they would be subject to citation. Their card. We still make them carry a card, a harvest record card with them. Their card would be invalidated, and then they would basically lose privilege for the rest of that season. And then they would have to retake the test to be able to be authorized the following season again.
So, Kyle, my next question for you was to just talk, or I guess request to you was to get you to talk a bit about the permit zones. We've mentioned them already multiple times in the identification test. Kelly spoke about those, as did Brandon. But is there anything that we're missing with regard to these permit zones? Where are they, and in each of the states? What is the situation with regard to Canada goose or white-cheeked goose harvest outside of the permit zone? So I guess a couple of questions. Anything we're missing with regard to the permit zones? And then outside of those permit zones, what does Canada goose harvest opportunity look like?
Yeah, there's nothing really to add. I mean, we keep talking about the different subspecies and sort of the considerations about them. The reality is in terms of a bag limit, when they eliminated the need for check stations and kind of having the sub bag limit for Duskys, when that all went away, it is just one bag limit. It is a at least on our side. Both sides, it's 4 Canada cackler together. It's the white-cheeked goose bag limit. And then there are separate bag limits for white fronts and snow geese. The only difference is that within these permit zones, we're requiring people to go through this step of actually taking this identification test. And at least on the Washington side, we make them carry this specific permit with them that says, yes, you are allowed to hunt in this zone. Outside of that, the only difference is that they're not required to take that test. The bag limit is the same, at least in Washington, regardless of which zone you're in. You don't get the overlap of the 7 species, with the exception of over in the Columbia Basin, the eastern side of Washington. We do have westerns, halves, and lessers all kind of mixed in together. But we think about how to lay out that season differently because of that. And so the different zones have that emphasis of what goose types do you anticipate hunters to encounter, but within the permit zone, it's just that requirement of the ID and basically a follow-up to try and derive a better estimate of total harvest out of that zone.
So the permit zones and the restrictions therein are driven solely by the presence of dusky Canada geese in those zones, right?
That is true. Yep. The difference is that the permit zone has a closed subspecies and the others don't. And so to try and draw the line between, okay, do you actually realize what that means? We make them go through an identification course so that we've basically said it as many times as we can. Duskies are closed. Duskies are closed. If you're in this zone, don't shoot a dusky, right? And outside of that, yes, the considerations are not anywhere near the same. It's just a Canada goose bag limit.
One question for each of you out of curiosity here. We're talking about this permit zone. Do you have an idea of the number of permittees, maybe offhand, that you have in your zone? And then what's the harvest that you see out of that permit zone? Brandon, I'll go to you first.
Yeah, so the total number of permittees, I don't have at the tip of my tongue. So the permit is good until you take a dusky, and most people don't. So there are thousands and thousands of hunters in our system that have the ability to get their goose permit. They just don't anymore. Certainly over 20,000 people have taken and passed this test in Oregon. But we do require, folks annually to get a goose permit, and it's cost them $2. And really, what it is them saying, "I'm going to potentially hunt in the permit zone for geese this year, and now you have the ability to know that and survey me." And so really it becomes a survey stratification question. So last year in the permit zone in Oregon, 5,570 people got their goose permit. When we did follow-up surveys with a random sample of those people, only about half of them actually hunted. So last year we estimated about 2,700 permit holders hunted. But we do know, for whatever reason, if it's a regulations confusion or complexity, there are a bunch of people who are hunting in our permit zone who don't have the goose permit. They've taken the test, but maybe they're confused about whether they actually need to get a new permit every year, that $2 permit, and they do. But we've got almost another 1,000 people who are hunting geese that haven't picked up their permit. And it's not almost 1,000. Last year we estimated 743. So, 1 in 5 people in our permit zone aren't getting their permit. And that would be, for the folks that are listening to this, if you are an Oregon permit zone hunter, you need to make sure you have that permit, because if law enforcement checks you and you don't, that's another potential citation. And so again, it's just $2. And really what that helps us do is do surveys for our monitoring purposes for harvest. So again, we've got about, just over 3,000 people that are hunting probably in this permit zone in Oregon for geese. And they're taking a fair amount of birds. Last year, we estimated 31,000 geese taken in our permit zone. That's unadjusted for any kind of reporting bias. And we know there are certainly some biases with how hunters report their harvest, especially when you call them or email them at the, tail end of the season and ask how many birds did you get? And they just round up, they don't know the exact number. So there's certainly probably a biased high estimate, but about 31,000. And generally about 65% of that is those small cacklers. So, about 20,000 of those cacklers. And then, 15% of that is our big westerns. The taverners and lessers combined are only about 10%. And then we actually have a pretty significant snow goose harvest now in Northwest Oregon. And about 5% of our harvest was snow geese last year. So of course, those numbers don't include anything on Duskys, because this is a random telephone survey. And we wouldn't expect that if somebody did accidentally or even purposely shoot a Dusky, we wouldn't expect that they'd tell us that in a telephone survey.
Yeah, so it sounds like you have a pretty good hunter population of people that go after the white-cheeked geese. So that's pretty cool. Good to hear those numbers. And Kyle, what about you in terms of the number of permittees and any idea of the harvest that you see on these geese in your permit zone in Washington?
Yeah, so we in Washington on our side, while we do require people to have a permit, really that permit is in the form of a harvest record card. And so anybody that's wanting to hunt in these 5 Southwest counties that are within this permit zone, they would be required to take that test and then to get this harvest record card to have on their person while out in the field, similar to what Brandon was saying. And if they got checked and they're hunting geese and they don't have that card, that would also make them subject to citation. But typically we see about 1,500 to 3,000 people that request the card, and typically those that actually, record some days, at least attempted days of harvest, is typically less than that, somewhere in the 1,000 to 1,500 hunters that are actually actively pursuing geese down in that zone. That typically translates to about 3,500 to 4,000 Canada cackler, the white-cheeked geese, being harvested. And similar to what Brandon said, about 2/3 of that, about 60 to 65%, tends to be the cacklers, the small little minima guys. We do have field checks. We have biologists and enforcement officers that do conduct field checks for species composition, so actual in-hand checks, Coleman measurements to actually differentiate the subspecies. There's a very popular federal National Wildlife Refuge, Ridgefield National Wildlife Refuge, that is a very popular spot for folks to go after waterfowl in general, but certainly an attempt at geese. Anyway, we do come across a handful of Duskys that are harvested every year by individuals, whether they, intentionally did it or not. Always hard to tell, but we do tend to pass about a dozen through our hands, which is a vast underestimate of reality. That's our typical number. And I guess the only reference for us is I mentioned over in the Columbia Basin, we also shoot some smaller geese. And while we shoot something like 500 to 4,000 over in the permit zone, we shoot closer to 12 to 15,000 mixture of Tabner, Lesser, and Cackler over in the Columbia Basin.
Yeah, sounds like pretty good harvest level there as well, outside that zone. Okay, guys, we're going to start wrapping up here. But before we do, I wanted to give each of you an opportunity to make any closing remarks. I know for a group of birds that has some restrictions around it, as those that we've discussed, will generate a number of questions for you throughout the year from your stakeholders, from your constituents. So I guess here's just an opportunity for you to communicate to some of those people about maybe the more common questions or concerns that you hear with regard to this group of birds. So Brandon, I'll go to you first. Any final messages regarding management around white-cheeked geese?
Yeah, there's just a couple of misconceptions that kind of always seem to persist out there, related specifically to Duskys. And one that I hear a lot is hunters complaining that, and this is hunters and fishermen, I think in general, it's always somebody else is getting our birds or our fish or whatever. And so there's this idea that subsistence users in Alaska are taking Duskys at will, but we're heavily regulated down here, and that's just not the case. In fact, where Duskys come from in Alaska, there is only a very limited subsistence season up there. And it's actually, it doesn't even include white-cheeked geese or their eggs. It's generally, a handful of ducks and then gull egging for different types of gulls. So that one is, just essentially just a false kind of statement. The Duskys don't have a subsistence harvest. Their real only harvest is sport harvest in Alaska and sport harvest in Oregon and Washington. And then the second one related to Duskys is that they're endangered. And certainly, from a hunter's standpoint, when we're going through all these gyrations that you can't shoot them, season's closed, all these extra protections and all the extra work that has been done on Duskys over the decades, well, there's certainly a different degree protection and management. They have never been endangered and hopefully never will be. That's certainly one of the things we as managers are going to try our best would be to keep Duskys at a population status where they would not be considered for listing under the Federal Endangered Species Act. Because if they were, our entire goose management, process and program here would turn on its head. It would be out of Kyle and I's hands. We'd be, I think, probably looking at, consideration of just closed goose seasons, period. We used to have a closed species, the Aleutians, or an endangered species, the Aleutian. And, there was basically no harvest of any geese in those areas for a long time. So that's just another misconception that I'd like to, make sure that hunters realize that we're not talking about an endangered species here. And we're not talking about a subsistence harvest issue.
And Kyle, the same opportunity for you. Any message to your hunters?
Yeah, I think just to kind of along with what Brandon was saying there, remembering that Dusky Canada geese, we're talking about maybe 15,000 individuals, definitely less than 20,000 individuals. And so, we, between the two states alone, we know that we have enough harvest pressure potential that, that's problematic. And so are there reasons that we go to these extents to try and, buffer any detrimental consequence to Duskies, but while providing those other opportunities for the more numerous cacklers? Well, yeah. And that's what we're trying to keep in our control. Like Brandon said, we'd rather that be a decision that the agencies are able to make rather than the decision being made for us. So the other thing I would throw in there is, there are some differences between how Washington and Oregon operate those opportunities, particularly how the public lands fit into that. and sort of the strategies of days of the week or open and closed periods of the season that come as a result. So I would just emphasize, if you are going to be attempting to goose hunt in those areas, by all means, please make sure that you've read the regulations relevant to your state and also the particular zone of that harvest potential, and just familiarize yourself with that. The more educated you can be on what can and can't I do, the better of an opportunity and sort of satisfying, recreational event it will be. And so just encourage you to do your homework ahead of time and be as knowledgeable as you can before you get out in the field.
That's probably one of my greatest fears, Kyle, is that somebody will someday run afoul of the law and they'll be speaking with a conservation officer or a trooper, as may be the case in Oregon, and they'll say, but this dude on the Ducks Unlimited podcast said this. And there's certainly nothing that comes out of my mouth with respect to harvest management should be taken as the basis for your decisions in the field. Make sure you study the regulations specific to the state in which you're going to be hunting. So thank you, guys. You've been very gracious with your time here on both of these episodes, and appreciate your willingness to participate in this conversation. I've learned a lot personally, and I know our listeners will as well. I'll also just kind of say that early on, I think I might have even mentioned we could possibly talk about snow geese or white fronts in one of these episodes. We obviously did not get to those species. There nevertheless does remain an interesting story probably to be told around those two, and maybe at some time in the future we will have you guys back on to discuss those, as I'd certainly enjoy hearing about some of those issues. But yeah, for now we're going to wrap this up, and good luck to the hunters out in Oregon and Washington the remainder of the season. These episodes will probably be coming out in January, so you'll still have some time afield, I think, by that time. Brandon, Kyle, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your expertise on this particular topic.
Yep, appreciate the opportunity to share a little bit about the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah, definitely good to talk to you, Mike, so appreciate it.
A very special thanks to our guest on today's episode, as well as our previous episode, Brandon Reiches, Migratory Game Bird Coordinator for Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, and Kyle Spragans, Waterfowl Section Manager for Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. As always, we thank our producer, Clay Baird, for the work he does editing these podcasts. And then, of course, to you, our listeners, we thank you for your support, passion, and commitment to wetlands and waterfowl conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.